everyone. So for my next video, I thought that it would be good to do my own list of reading recommendations. I do a lot of reading, and so I wanted to share some of my favorite resources with all of you. So let's try to keep this short, sweet, and to the point. So I will try, if I can figure out my editing software, to put text in the screen, but if I can't figure out how to do that, I'll just put links to everything in the description. But that being said, my number one reading recommendation is for you to go to sacredtexts.com, and that is sacred/texts.com. It is a wonderful free resource for every single myth, legend, occult, supernatural topic you could probably think of. They have copies of many different translations of myths and mythologies from all around the world, and that includes our favorite prose and poetic eddas. So definitely check out that website. Everything on there is free. So I highly encourage you to get lost down that rabbit hole. That being said, that segues into my number two reading recommendation, which of course is the prose edda and the poetic edda. There's many places out there in which you can find translations of those, both in print and online. Like I said, sacredtexts.com is one of those places, and they have a couple different translations, I think. But if you're not a big reader, my other recommendation would be to pick up the audiobook for the Neo-Pagan version of Norse mythology. I've been listening to that ever since getting on board this whole Norse paganism train, and so that's been really fun to listen to as kind of a refresher for all the Norse myths, because it's been a while since I've read some of those. So if you're not a big reader and you just want to listen to all of those classic stories, definitely go check out the Neo-Pagan version. Let's see. My number three book, which I don't have an example of right now because I only have a digital copy, but I highly recommend that anyone who calls himself a pagan or a Wiccan or a witch go pick up a copy of The Spiral Dance by Starhawk. And this book, I believe, was first published in the 70s, and so they recently came out with a new revised edition that kind of updates a lot of her beliefs and rituals to be a lot more inclusive. But the reason I highly recommend this book to everybody is, while it is a lot more Wiccan based in terms of being focused on that triple goddess and horn god worship, I think it just serves as a really good primer for basic witchcraft and paganism beliefs and practices, and especially if for me, with having Freya as my matron, it's really goddess worship focused, which I like. And so I think it's just a really good foundation in terms of cosmology, mythology, and beliefs and practices that we could use to form the foundations of our own Neo-Pagan practice. So definitely check out that book. And moving right along, the next book on my list I do have a hard copy of to show you. And that is this hefty tome called The Secret Teachings of All Ages, and it is by Manly P. Hall. This is a massive book, but it's worth skimming through, trust me, especially if you, like me, are really interested in comparative mythology. It's an excellent resource. So, The Secret Teachings of All Ages goes in depth into what they say is a lot of ancient pagan practices and traditions, and especially stemming from things like the Greek Eleusinian mystery cults, the secret cults of Dionysus and of goddess worship, and conversely, with Isis and her mystery schools. It really touches on a lot of those, and in this book I think it kind of tries to tie a lot of these rituals into like some of the more modern Masonic rituals that you might see practiced today, but it's just a really great book for anyone who's interested in history and mythology, and especially like me, for someone who likes to research comparative myths. It's a great read. It's definitely not anything that I have yet to read cover to cover. It's just more something that you can skim through depending on what topic you're most interested in, because like I said, some chapters are going to be more like God focused, and then other ones are more goddess focused. So it's just a really great book. Another book which they speak of a lot in The Secret Teachings of All Ages, and which I read back in college when I was doing a lot of my English and comparative mythology research there, is The Golden Bough by James Frazer. And this book, I think, also touches on a lot of those old mystery cults, but his emphasis is more on the tracing the comparisons and the histories behind the dying god mythos, the dying and resurrected God, which we see in current religion and in the worship of Jesus Christ. A lot of what you see from the worship of him stems from these ancient pagan religions that focused on gods like Freyr, for example, who represented the harvest and fertility and agriculture. So it's a really great resource to go to for Neo-Pagans today. I know a lot of Neo-Pagan religions formed their basis out of James Frazer's research. And so for me, I just think it's a really good resource for anyone who's interested in exploring maybe more of like the Druidic side of paganism and those type of practices, because I feel like a lot of the Druidic and like maybe Celtic mythologies contain a lot of aspects of that dying god mythos. So yeah, James Frazer's The Golden Bough, definitely check that out. It might actually be up on Sacred Texts, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. So the sixth thing that kind of, in my mind, goes hand in hand, that you should read after you go and read the prose and poetic Eddas is the Finnish epic, the Kalevala. And I find it very interesting that when you go and read that story, a lot of the characters and stories and themes are very similar to what you'll read in a lot of the Norse myths. And to me, it's almost as though these are some of the same stories, but you're seeing it from the other side's perspective. And this segues into some of my final reading recommendations, which, stick with me, are actually fiction fantasy books, but hear me out. A really good fantasy book series that I recommend anyone who loves reading, fantasy, paganism, Norse paganism, check out is the Winter of the World trilogy by Michael Scott Rohan. So here's my very old beat up copy right here of the first book, which is called The Anvil of Ice. And then there's two more books that follow. I believe you can find them as ebook versions online now, because they were out of print for a long time. But this trilogy draws very heavily from the Kalevala, and also features a lot of deities from Norse mythology. Like you'll see Odin pop up, Laufey is a character, and they're just really good books, and I especially highly recommend them to anyone who is interested in blacksmithing, because the main character is a smith, and it kind of mirrors the main characters in the Finnish Kalevala, who is Ilmarinen, the god of smithcraft. So yeah, if you're into blacksmithing like I am, definitely highly recommend that you read this series, because the main character is a smith, and so it really gets in depth into like the kinds of things he makes and how he weaves magic into his craft, and the different techniques that he's able to invent and use. And oh man, in addition to just kind of exploring history and prehistory and mythology and all that kind of stuff that piques my interest, it's just great characters, great plot. Highly recommend that you read the Winter of the World series if you're into Norse mythology. And along with that, my final recommendations for reading are the fantasy series by Marion Zimmer Bradley and Diana Paxson, which is The Ancestors of Avalon. Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon, I think, was such a popular and acclaimed book when it came out, because if I could recall correctly, I mean, some of this was before my time, but it seemed to be one of the first fantasy novels to focus on a feminine perspective, especially in regards to Arthurian legend, because so much of the focus up until then was on Arthur and his knights and all the stories of the Knights of the Round Table. So The Mists of Avalon portrays all of those stories from the women's point of view. And after that book came out, Diana Paxson, who I believe is actually the leader of an Asatru-based religious group now, teamed up with her to write a series of prequels that take place in Great Britain throughout its history, tracing it, as far back as they claim to Atlantis, which don't even get me started on the myth of Atlantis, because I could talk about that all day. But the reason I recommend that people go read these books, and you might be asking yourself, Amy, what does the Mists of Avalon and Arthurian legend have to do with Norse paganism? But here's my thinking. A, I love fantasy. B, I love Arthurian legend. And C, I love history. This book combines all of those things. But in addition, since it is so feminine focused, it has a lot of what I think are not entirely historically inaccurate depictions of goddess worship and Druidic practices as they may have looked back in those times. Because I would think, with the qualifications that Diana Paxson has, she would have done her research in writing these books. So, once again, for me, as someone who's a follower of Freya and more Vanatru leaning and goddess worship leaning, I think they're just really good books for anyone who's into those topics and just maybe interested in seeing kind of a historical fantasy take on what some of these rituals and goddess rituals would have looked like. And, I'm very new to this faith, but I'm feeling like the further I go into it, the more I might end up getting pulled into kind of a Norse Gael, pagan, Norse, Germanic, pagan, because these peoples in these stories are all very intermixed and intermingled throughout the centuries. So I feel like a lot of them you could probably trace back to some type of common origin or ancestry in a lot of cases. So I don't think that it's out of line or out of the question at all for someone to embrace Norse paganism as well as like Celtic, British, Germanic gods, because I think that they share a lot of similarities and a lot of similar origins. So there you have it. That's just my quick little reading list of all the books that I have currently read and enjoyed. I'm sure that as my journey takes me further in my quest of knowledge, I know I've been doing so much reading these past couple months that I'm sure I will be making another video at some point in the future with more books that I read and would recommend, but I'll just leave you with those for now. A good little mix of scholarly and some fantasy fun in there for you, so check them out. Let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye.